we are happy to have you, and we're very sure that today is a very consequential day, to say the least. So we can get started now. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. And I just want to reiterate again, if you have any questions throughout the talk, please submit them, and we'll have the Q&A segment after the discussion. Today's topic concerns phenomena we believe we are all too familiar with, especially those of us studying, those of us who are students of Islamic studies. When you think of the great books of Islamic civilization, perhaps some of the first items that come to mind are Imam al-Shafi'i's legal treatise Kitab al-Risala, or Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, his seminal work on history and sociology. But what if the textual canon of Islamic scholarship today looked different just a century prior? What if seminal works from Ibn Qayyim, At-Tabari, and Ibn Taymiyyah only in the past century started to surface through the use of print? Print production was consequential to the presence of many texts and figures that permeate our imagination. Professor El Shamsy demonstrates how a large body of Islamic classical works went through a period of disappearance during the 16th to 19th centuries in what he defines as the post-classical period, only to be rediscovered 4 centuries later. But what was at stake in this advent of rediscovery? What methods were employed in the resuscitation of Islamic classics? Were the methods and instruments used in publishing these texts simply innocuous or neutral, or were they contingent upon the whims and subjectivities of the actors who put them to use? Who were the actors engaged in this practice, and for what purposes? Was the printing press the cause for the circulation and availability of the text, or were they simply the means? These are questions taken up by our guest lecturer today. And I would like to just give a brief introduction of myself. My name is Ameen Omar. I will be serving as the moderator for the discussion today. I am the president of the Student Council and a second-year MA student at the College of Islamic Studies, where I major in Islamic Studies with a concentration in civilization and society. And our main speaker today, Professor Ahmed El Shamsy, who joins us from the city of Chicago, is an associate professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago, where he studies the intellectual history of Islam, focusing on the evolution of the classical Islamic disciplines and scholarly culture within their broad historical context. His research addresses themes such as orality and literacy, the history of the book, and the theory and practice of Islamic law. His first book, The Canonization of Islamic Law, a Social and Intellectual History, traces the transformation of Islamic law from a primarily oral tradition to a systematic written discipline in the 8th and 9th century. And his second book, which is the subject of today's discussion, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition, shows how Arab editors and intellectuals in the 19th and early 20th centuries used the newly adopted medium of printing to rescue classical Arabic texts from oblivion and to popularize them as the classics of Islamic thought. Other research projects investigate the interplay of Islam with other religious and philosophical traditions. I would also like to introduce our discussants for today's discussion, Professor Alexandre Caeiro, who is the associate professor at CIS. He was trained in sociology and in Islamic studies in France, the Netherlands, and Egypt. His research deals broadly with the transformations of Islamic law in modern contexts. He is currently working on the legal history of Gulf Sheikhdom, focusing on the interactions between emirs, Sharia judges, merchants, and British agents in the context of the development of an oil economy and modern state institutions. I would also like to introduce our other discussants, Professor Frank Peter, an assistant professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies here at the college. Professor Peter has studied modern history, Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, and Arabic in Hamburg and Damascus. Before joining Hamid bin Khalifa, he was assistant professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Bern, where he received his habilitation in Islamic studies with a forthcoming monograph entitled Islam and the Governing of Muslims in France, Secularism Without Religion. He has co-edited a number of volumes, including Islamic Movements of Europe, Public Religion and Islamophobia in the Modern World, and Islam and the Politics of Culture in Europe, Memory, Aesthetics, Art. And just some quick housekeeping, the format of today's event will start with a talk from Professor Shamsy, and shortly then after, Dr. Caeiro and Dr. Peter will then raise the first questions to which Dr. Shamsy will be able to answer. Afterwards, we will open for Q&A. If you have any questions, again, this is the third time I'm reiterating. If you have questions, please submit them to all panelists to ensure that they are seen by everyone. You can do this by clicking the More Options tab on the bottom right of the chat dialog designated by 3 dots. The same should apply if you're logging in through the mobile app. With that said, I now kindly like to give the floor to Professor Shamsy.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning from Chicago. Thank you very much for inviting me, Ameen, Professors Caeiro and Peter. I'm very grateful that you're attending and that you're ready to engage with my work. And thank you, everybody, for attending virtually to this talk. I know this is maybe not the best of times. There's a lot of things I had to deal with this morning with my students and classes, etc., given the elections that happened yesterday. So, but thank you again for inviting me, because I very much enjoy engaging with the material that I've written my book about, and I very much am willing to learn about positions by other people and learn more about it. I do not consider my book to be somehow the last word on the topic, but rather a kind of a beginning of a discussion that I want to engage with. So to start with, the historian Thomas Macho once described cultures as islands in the ocean of oblivion. Almost all thought that have ever been thought, and almost all words that have ever been spoken, have been irretrievably lost in this ocean. Yet our species has developed tools to resist oblivion. One of these tools is cyclical repetition, festivals, rituals, whether religious or otherwise, and they are commemorations in which we remember and re-remember past events and maintain memory of them by introducing successive generations to them. Another mechanism is orally transmitted poems and stories, such as fairy tales, fables, epic poems like the Iliad, and pre-Islamic poetry. But the historically most significant invention for preserving memories is writing, a technique first developed in Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. Ever since, writing has been the primary mode of maintaining cultural coherence over time. Writing inscribes ideas and information on physical materials that can be decoded and consumed by contemporaries and future generations alike. Memory thus acquires a home outside of ourselves, and its survival is no longer tied to the survival of those that hold it. This means that the medium of writing can do something that neither rituals nor oral stories can. It can persist even through periods of neglect. An orally transmitted folk tale that is not retold for a generation is gone forever. but a book can lay forgotten for a millennium, and then, as long as the physical object survives and the language it is written in still known, it can be rediscovered and reintroduced into cultural circulation. Therefore, books can act as something like a cultural subconsciousness, a latent store of ideas and words that can, when the conditions are ripe, re-emerge into contemporary awareness. This is what happened in the European Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries. Forgotten Greek and Latin texts from classical antiquity were rediscovered in places such as monasteries and reintroduced to the reading public, sparking new literary, philosophical, and aesthetic movements. A similar renaissance took place in the Middle East in the 19th and early 20th centuries, only on a much larger scale. This was the rediscovery of classical Arabic literature, much of which had been almost completely forgotten, but which became suddenly, in the space of mere decades, both widespread and hugely popular. I'm referring here to works authored mostly between the 9th and 16th centuries by scholars who are widely seen as the founders and key figures of the traditional Islamic disciplines of law, theology, hadith, philosophy, historiography, linguistics, and so on. Over most of its more than a millennium-long history, Arabic literature in its various genres took the form of manuscript codices, written by hand and primarily produced by professional scribes. This meant that books were generally produced on demand. If you wanted a copy of a particular book, you would either copy it yourself from someone else's copy, or pay a scribe to make a copy for you. But if a given book wasn't in demand, it didn't get copied. And as manuscripts degrade over time, particularly with kind of modern paper that is not acid-free, it kind of becomes yellow and falls apart, gets eaten by worms, etc. The lack of new copies and the shrinking number of existing copies will eventually threaten the survival of the book itself. The consequences of this phenomenon on a wide scale were evident in the 19th century Middle East. It's not that Arab readers had no books to read at the time. In madrasas and mosques across the Arab lands, students still gathered around teachers to study and copy written teaching texts, just like they had done for centuries. But since the 16th century, education in the various corners of the Muslim world had been structured around an increasingly uniform curriculum of works, all rooted in a relatively small number of teaching texts, the mutun, that were encased in multiple layers of subsequent commentary. So a typical scholarly book read in the Arabic world in the beginning of the 19th century would have the succinct base text in the middle of each page, and arrayed around it would be primary commentaries, the shuruh, glosses, hawashi, which were usually but not always based on the primary commentaries, and sometimes tertiary commentaries, taqarir, that is, commentaries on glosses, on commentaries. These commentary layers were fundamentally scholastic in nature, that is, they analyzed in excruciating detail the lexical, rhetorical, and logical features of the base text, but they often had nothing to say about the text's actual subject matter. A Syrian scholar, Muhammad Munir Agha, studied a short book of theology with a famous professor at Al-Azhar in the 19th century. And he complained that the professor spent more than 2 weeks elucidating the linguistic features of just the first line of the introduction. By the end of the year, he hadn't even covered the full introduction, even though the introduction is only a few lines long. Meanwhile, the actual theological content of the book was entirely ignored, leading Munir Agha to describe his study experience as one of traversing a lifeless desert. These kinds of books, and especially the commentary layers, were overwhelmingly products of the 16th to 19th centuries. I call this the post-classical period, to contrast it with the earlier classical period. The dominance of such post-classical clusters of base texts and commentary was not confined to teaching. The same limited roster of recent books dominated the public and private libraries that we can reconstruct from this period, and they were also the texts that post-classical authors overwhelmingly cited in their own writings. This indicates that 17th to 19th century Arab readers were familiar with a surprisingly narrow range of literature, most of it written within the 3 centuries of their lifetime. Earlier literature survived as quotations or second-hand references in the post-classical works, but the classical books themselves were rarely read, and thus no new copies were made. How about all the copies of books from the classical period? They were in peril too. Since the Middle Ages, Arabic books had been preserved primarily in thriving quasi-public libraries that were housed in mosques, madrasas, Sufi lodges, and supported by perpetual endowments, the awqaf. But by the 19th century, the collections of most of these institutions were no longer accessible to scholars or the broader public. In part, this was because the Ottoman conquest of Egypt and Syria in the 16th century had moved the center of political and economic power to Istanbul and downgraded the former twin hubs of Arabic culture, Cairo and Damascus, to mere provincial capitals with impoverished resources and plummeting institutional support for scholarship. With the shift in political power came a shift in the fortunes of the Arabic language, which was eclipsed by Ottoman and Persian. The scribal classes, which had been the crucial engine of Arabic written culture ever since the famed literary courtiers Abd al-Hamid al-Katib and Ibn al-Muqatta'a in the 8th century, began to favor Ottoman and Persian in their literary output, and this trend continued until the 19th century. Even religious scholars in non-Arabic speaking areas wrote increasingly in languages other than Arabic. With the loss of resources, support, and prestige, few new libraries were founded in the Arab world in the 17th to 19th centuries to preserve rare books, and the existing libraries suffered badly. Their endowments faltered and were not replaced, and they could not afford to pay for necessary repairs, maintenance, and librarians. Most importantly, books were relatively easy to convert into money, and this made them the first casualty of shortfalls in endowment income and of embezzlement in times of political instability and diminished legal supervision. In this precarious situation, European book collectors saw a golden opportunity. For European Orientalists, the Arab lands were a storehouse of a still little-known intellectual tradition. Beginning in earnest with the French scholars who accompanied Napoleon on his invasion to Egypt in 1798, book collectors, often in the role of colonial administrators and consuls, made fortunes and careers out of the systematic and occasionally unlawful acquisition of Arabic manuscripts for the libraries of Europe and later North America. European book collectors had deep pockets and voracious appetites for Arabic manuscripts, and the countless books they funneled overseas were subsequently inaccessible to Arab readers and scholars who often didn't even know whether particular books still existed. The flow of tens of thousands of Arabic manuscripts out of the Islamic world made a significant dent in the Arabic written tradition. It exacerbated the decline of traditional institutions of book preservation and left works that did not belong to the post-classical curriculum at grave risk of total loss. Indeed, these works might have been lost entirely were it not for a series of developments that were triggered by the modernization of Arab societies and that revolutionized Arabic book culture beginning in the 19th century. I will briefly describe 3 of these developments now. The first was the establishment of modern libraries in the Arabic world. These were state-funded and regulated institutions dedicated to the systematic collection and preservation of books, including books that were not in common use. These libraries were inspired by and often modeled directly on the research libraries that Arab travelers had encountered on their visits to Europe. One such visitor was the prominent Egyptian bureaucrat and scholar Ali Mubarak, who was deeply impressed by the Orientalist libraries he encountered during his trip to France, and subsequently managed to persuade the Egyptian Khedive Ismail to establish a national library on the model of the French National Library in 1870. The library's mission, as proclaimed by the Khedive, was to rescue valuable endowed manuscripts from dispersal and preserve them for the nation. The Egyptian National Library eventually became one of the 2 most important manuscript collections in the Arabic world, the other one, the Zahiriya Library in Damascus, which was the product of the joint efforts of the reformist Ottoman governor Midhat Pasha and the local scholar Tahir al-Jazairi. The second development was the rise of a new interest in classical literature among readers who were increasingly impatient with the formalism and technical preoccupations of the post-classical commentary works, and who longed for the broader horizons and uncluttered language of classical literature. Some of these readers were part of the mainstream scholarly establishment, such as Hassan al-Attar. Al-Attar had been trained at Al-Azhar and became the Sheikh al-Azhar in 1830, so he was a quintessential establishment figure. But he was dissatisfied with the narrow scholastic orthodoxy of his day, and in his own teaching, and particularly with his closest students, Al-Attar drew in a far wider selection of topics and writings in history, geography, and literature that was common for Azhari scholars at the time, even using works by controversial and marginalized authors. This emerging appetite for classical works often went hand in hand with a willingness to critique established doctrines. The interests of classical-minded scholars such as Al-Attar overlapped with those of a different and much larger contingency, namely an emerging elite of well-connected and wealthy book lovers who had at most one foot in the old scholarly tradition and the other in the structure and discourses of the rapidly modernizing state. This new class of scribal intellectuals valorized high-level Arabic, rare manuscripts, and philological accuracy. They adopted Arabic rather than Ottoman or Persian as the language of high culture and sought to achieve a cultural renaissance through the rediscovery of classical texts, especially histories, ethical advice literature, and early works of poetry and prose. Prominent figures such as Abd al-Hamid Nafi' and Abd al-Ghani Fikri competed with each other to uncover long-lost treasures, flaunting their discoveries in their weekly literary salons. An evocative anecdote that illustrates the ethos of this class concerns the collected poems of the famous 9th century poet al-Buhturi. In spite of al-Buhturi's fame, his collected poems were unknown and unavailable in late 19th century Egypt. So when Fikri heard of that a bookseller had brought a copy of this work to Cairo, he rushed to buy it, only to be told that the bookseller had promised the manuscript to Fikri's rival Nafi'. Undeterred, Fikri persuaded the seller to rent the manuscript to him for 24 hours for an exorbitant sum, and then had his in-house copyists work feverishly throughout the night to produce a copy. The next day, Fikri returned the original to the bookseller, who promptly delivered it to Nafi'. At his next salon, Nafi', unaware of Fikri's coup, boasted of owning Cairo's only copy of al-Buhturi's poems. Fikri haughtily pulled out his own copy and exclaimed, "Calm down, brother, we have already engorged ourselves on this." Last but not least, the third development, which paralleled and amplified the other two, was the adoption of printing as the central medium of book production and circulation. The technology of printing had arrived in Istanbul via Jewish refugees from Spain within decades of Johannes Gutenberg's death in 1468. But Arabic books were not printed in the Middle East until the 18th century. In part, the reason lies in the relatively small size of the reading public for book-length prints in Arabic, which was further constrained by the post-classical preference for Ottoman and Persian literature. Even in an important Arab country such as Egypt, the potential readership for a printed book around the year 800 probably numbered in the mere tens of thousands. The printing industry in the Arab world took off on a large scale in the 1820s, with the establishment of an Egyptian state press in Bulaq, Cairo's port district. The more than 300 titles published by the Bulaq press in its first 20 years of operation were overwhelmingly technical manuals in the field of medicine, mathematics, military sciences, and the likes. They included only a handful of works belonging to the Arabic Islamic scholarly tradition, in particularly works on Arabic grammar and syntax used in the newly established state schools. However, in the late 1840s, the state press decided to permit private individuals to use its facilities in order to publish books of their choice, and this step was soon followed by the establishment of new private presses in Egypt, as well as elsewhere in the Arab world, such as Morocco, Tunisia, Syria, and Iraq. These developments transformed the book publishing landscape. Book collectors such as Nafi', the Buhturi aficionado, could now rent the state press or commission a private press to print copies of some of their most prized manuscripts, thus making widely available works that had until then been legendary for their rarity. And prominent public figures such as Rifat al-Tahtawi used their exceptional access to the instruments and resources of the state to promote the printing of books that were dictated neither by school curricula nor by profit considerations, but rather by the overarching goal of introducing forgotten but valuable ideas to the Arabic reading public. These are the three developments that supported the rediscovery of classical Arabic books in the early 19th century: the foundation of modern libraries, an explosion of interest in classical literature, and the new availability of print technology that could disseminate rediscovered works quickly and efficiently. Other factors that played a role included the spread of public education and of mass print media such as journals and newspapers, which enabled information about literary works to reach the growing reading public. All of these trends set the stage for a wave of editions and prints of classical works of Arabic literature and Islamic thought in the second half of the 19th century and beyond. The work of locating, piecing together, and editing classical works, and of securing publishers and financing in their printing, was carried out by a diverse range of individuals. Many of them were motivated by visions of reform, and they sought to use the resuscitated works to combat contemporary cultural, social, and religious ills. So they targeted books whose ideas and aesthetics they felt could contribute to the revival of Islamic and Arabic culture, and they inaugurated institutions, practices, and networks to support the dissemination of their discoveries across society. The motivations, goals, and approaches of these bibliophiles and editors were diverse. Some sought to reinvigorate the established scholarly tradition, others to undermine it. Some emphasized the socially relevant messages conveyed in rediscovered older works, while others focused on their aesthetically superior form. Some consciously followed the Orientalist tradition of editing and scholarship. Others used classical texts as tools to critique Orientalism and its claim to privileged expertise. For example, the well-known Egyptian reformer Muhammad Abdu saw what he perceived as the low standard of post-classical Arabic prose as a central obstacle to the country's cultural renaissance, to the Nahda. In his view, contemporary Arabic was encumbered by excessive ornamentation and Persianate influences, and it was thus no longer conducive to clear public discourse and the formulation and expression of ethical sentiments. To counter this perceived decadence, Abdu used his official position at Al-Azhar and the state bureaucracy to promote classical literature as a superior linguistic model. Among other things, he incorporated classical ethical works into his classes at Al-Azhar, set and enforced standards for language use in private newspapers, and achieved the publication of important classical works. Meanwhile, legal scholars such as the Egyptian Ahmed El Shamsy and the Syrian Jamal ad-Din al-Qasimi drew on classical literature to rejuvenate what they saw as the ossified legal orthodoxy of their time. They did so by re-injecting into legal discourse ideas, arguments, and texts that had been sidelined by the post-classical tradition. Al-Husayni painstakingly assembled and digested classical works of the Shafi'i school and achieved the publication of some of the oldest surviving works on Islamic law. Al-Qasimi gathered and published classical works on legal theory that supported his call for jurists to use independent reasoning, ijtihad, to develop rulings from scratch instead of relying solely on existing precedents. The classical literature was also harnessed for the reform of religious practice. For example, the Iraqi scholar Mahmoud Shukri al-Alusi was vehemently opposed to the popular practice of saint veneration and shrine visitation, which he saw as socially harmful and intellectually dangerous superstitions. Accordingly, he used arguments drawn from theological treatises by classical authors such as Ibn Taymiyyah to challenge the validity of these practices. The goal of reforms like al-Alusi and his Damascene correspondent al-Qasimi was not the re-establishment of a mythical, pure vision of Islam. Rather, they sought to expand the horizons of Islamic thought practice beyond post-classical traditionalism by drawing on the resources contained in classical literature. But the neoclassicist reformers faced an uphill task. In the early days of printing, decisions as to which book to publish were largely made by the market. Presses would print these books that were known to be in demand and that were thus likely to sell in sufficient copies to merit the initial costs. The actual work of preparing a book for printing was carried out by an employee of the press, the musahih, the corrector, whose job was to piece together a coherent text from whatever manuscripts he could get his hands on, resolve textual puzzles and lacunae as best as he could, and catch as many errors and misprints as possible in spite of few or no proof runs and tight production schedule. But as access to printing expanded and interest in hitherto marginal classical works grew, both the opportunities and the challenges posed by printing changed. On the one hand, anyone who could provide a complete manuscript and the funds to cover its printing could now play a role in determining which books could reach the public. But on the other hand, the problem of locating manuscripts, editing them, and securing financing for them were magnified. The first challenge lay in simply finding out about and obtaining copies of classical works that in many cases survived only in a few or fragmentary copies, often held in private libraries about which little information was publicly available. Consequently, book collectors such as Ahmed Zaki and Ahmed Taimur spent lots of time and efforts on the search for manuscripts. Zaki in particular traveled widely throughout the Middle East and Europe. He bought manuscripts from private owners in Yemen and Syria, copied or photographed others in imperial libraries of Istanbul, and exchanged information on rare works on his trips to Orientalist congresses in London, Geneva, Hamburg, and Athens. His crowning achievement was as a collector was gaining access to the 14,000 manuscripts of the Topkapi Palace Library, which had previously been off limits to scholars. Like many other collectors, both Taimur and Zaki opened their private libraries to all interested readers, and Taimur further compiled detailed catalogues for his library as well as indices for books within it. Zaki and Taimur belonged to far-reaching networks of scholars and bibliophiles who exchanged letters, manuscripts, and information on classical Arabic books. To give you just a few examples, the participants in these networks included the previously mentioned Jamaluddin al-Qasimi, who scoured the holdings of the Zahiriya library in Damascus, and sent the discoveries to be printed in Egypt, the Lebanese writer Jurji Zaidan, who relied on Taimur's knowledge of Arabic historiography for his historical novels, the European Orientalist Louis Massignon and Ignaz Goldziher, who traded information on manuscripts with Syrian and Iraqi scholars, the well-connected Indian scholar Siddiq Hassan Khan, who publicized his book discoveries in printed summaries, the Iraqi priest and historian Anastas al-Karmali, who helped Zaki decipher obscure place names in classical works. These international connections allowed book collectors and editors to overcome often daunting odds in order to get hold of rare classical works that they wanted to publish. Once a book had been identified and a reasonably complete copy had been obtained, the actual work of editing began. In the case of newly discovered classics, this work was increasingly carried out not by a press corrector doing his job, but a different novel cultural figure, an editor. The editor was typically an expert scholar who had identified a particular book as valuable and who undertook the task of reconstructing its text independently, not at the behest of a publisher. Initially, such editors either were not named in the printed editions or were credited with things such as correction of the manuscript or arrangement of the publication. But beginning with Ahmed Zaki and his edition of an 8th century ethical treatise by Ibn al-Muqaffa', the Al-Adab al-Saghir, in 1911, the role acquired the dedicated title Muhaqqiq, which we now use primarily as translating the word editor. Although editors, unlike correctors, generally enjoyed a high degree of independence from the press, their task was in many ways more difficult. In contrast to the situation with popular post-classical works, which were in wide circulation and were usually available in countless well-established copies, scholars working with classical works recovered from the brink of oblivion often had to patch texts together out of scattered fragments and solve textual problems without access to alternative manuscripts or widely available reference works. They also aspired to higher editorial standards than those seen in early printed editions. Whereas an early publication such as the 1857 print of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, prepared by the corrector Nasruddin al-Hurini, provided no information on the manuscripts used and freely combined passages from two different recensions, Zaki and the editors who followed him wrote informative introductions to their editions, highlighted emendations and variants in a critical apparatus, and included additional features such as annotations and indexes in their editions. Given the high initial cost of typesetting and printing, a book and the uncertain market of classical works that did not yet have an established audience, the final and considerable hurdle to be surmounted was money. Numerous individuals, including book collectors and editors themselves, but also businessmen and public figures with an interest in classical literature, poured personal funds into the publication of texts that they felt could make an important contribution to society. Ahmed El Shamsy, the jurist I mentioned earlier, sold 20 acres of prime agricultural land in Egypt to finance the publication of Shafi'i's Kitab al-Umm and Risala. The Bahraini pearl merchant Muqbil al-Zakir underwrote the printing of works by Ibn Taymiyyah by selling an exquisite set of pearls to the Parisian jewelry house Cartier, which in turn exchanged it for what is now known as the Cartier building on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And the Emir of Qatar, Qasim ibn Muhammad Al Thani, provided financial support for the publication of several important works that had been discovered in Damascus by Jamal ad-Din al-Qasimi. As an aside, the involvement of the Qatari ruling family in the printing of classical texts between, say, 1900 and 1950 or 70 would make a great research project for a BA or MA thesis, or even a doctoral dissertation, especially if one could draw on private archives in Qatar. So just as a inspiration for people who might be watching. In addition, from the 1860s onwards, a range of innovative public initiatives were launched to finance the publication of classical works. The Egyptian Scholarly Society, the Jam'iyyat al-Ma'arif al-Misriya, was basically a book club whose members paid annual dues. These were used to subsidize the printing of classical texts that were then sold to the public, with members receiving a discounted price. A similar crowdfunding scheme headed by prominent political figures was proposed for the publication of Nuwairi's massive encyclopedia, whose cost would have been prohibitive otherwise. To summarize, the 19th and early 20th century witnessed a revolution in Arabic and Islamic literature. With all the transformations in Arabic societies, the spread of literacy, the establishment of modern state structures, the challenge of European domination, and so on, the growing Arabic reading public became increasingly impatient with the literary values of its post-classical predecessors and demanded literature that spoke to the concerns and aesthetics of their own time, literature that they found in part by reaching into the past and resurrecting books that had been forgotten for centuries. The range of available books and ideas thus expanded dramatically. Reformers of various stripes, frustrated by the religious and cultural orthodoxies of their time, took advantage of these developments to mine the literary tradition for indigenous and authentic resources with which to reform language, ethics, theology, law, and religious life. The technology of printing and the publishing industry that grew around it served as a magnifier that allowed even works that had all but disappeared from circulation, sometimes clinging to existence in a single, forgotten manuscript copy, to be resurrected and re-injected into the cultural bloodstream.
Thank you very much, Professor Shamsy, for that very invigorating, insightful talk. I now would like to give the floor to our discussants for their comments, and we will like to start with Professor Caeiro.
Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you so much, Professor Shamsy, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you to the Student Council also for inviting me to be part of this discussion. So I've prepared a number of comments here that I'm going to read out. I think the book, the history of print culture that is offered achievement based on meticulous research in Arabic and European languages. It is an engaging and fascinating. So, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics documents the transition, as Professor Shamsy explained, the transition from a scholastic culture shaped by esoteric epistemologies and centered around a limited set of post-classical texts and commentaries, to a new and expansive world of print, created by a new set of actors who edit, publish, and make classical scholarship available for a variety of intellectual projects. This transformation is depicted by and large as a transition from an enchanted world of inspired saints, dream visions, and authoritarian arguments to a much more disenchanted world of textual and rational argumentation, critical philology, and associated experts. Professor El Shamsy tells, in other words, an actor-centered history to illustrate broader cultural and institutional shifts. He identifies material and intellectual processes at the heart of this transformation, paying attention to financial constraints, reading publics, and the emergence of new classes of intellectuals and professionals associated with state and non-state institutions, forming a powerful cultural movement in the context of modern state formation, primarily in Egypt. The impact of print is related to the kinds of works that become available. And although this is slightly less elaborated in the book, print also seems to facilitate a reorganization of Islamic knowledge, a turn towards history, ethics, and literature as sources of aesthetic value and moral guidance. While Professor El Shamsy acknowledges the importance of modern state formation and colonialism as relevant contexts for the emergence of print culture in the Arab world, his account offers primarily, I think, an intellectual history which decenters the nation state and politics that have figured so prominently in other accounts of the consequences of printing. And the story that is told here as a result is less a story of crisis than of creativity and resourcefulness. And I think the book raises many interesting questions, opens up many avenues for further research. These questions, to my mind, include the following: the scope and limits of an actor-oriented approach when it comes to an analysis of the print revolution, the fascinating relation between religious reform, literary sensibility, and language politics, which Professor El Shamsy brings to light, and questions related to the geographical scope of the study, in particular the place of the Arabian Peninsula, and more specifically India, which comes up regularly in the transformations that are described. Here, for the purposes of the Q&A, I want to focus on 4 other issues. The first question is a question about representation. So the study focuses on the careers of a number of collectors, editors, and publishers who shaped the print revolution in Egypt and in the Arab world. Most prominently, perhaps, Abd al-Hamid Nafi', Ahmed Taimur, Ahmed al-Husseini, Ahmed Zaki, Muhammad Abdu, Tahir al-Jazairi, among others. Most of these actors seem to be social and religious reformers of some kind. And I think Professor Shamsy selected them logically because they feature prominently in the efforts to publish Islamic literature from the classical period. But I found myself asking, what exactly do these actors represent in the intellectual landscapes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries? What might be the cost of representing the print revolution in the Arab world in terms of an internal struggle between reformers and traditionalists? The period under discussion is, of course, a period of new context and new synthesis between various ideologies, including liberalism, republicanism, socialism, anarchism, fascism, and the emerging Islamist movement. We don't hear so much about these underlying intellectual currents in the book, although there are some references to the increasing circulation of rival philosophical and religious ideas. The full range of these ideas and how their advocates also might turn to print to disseminate them, I think could be further elaborated. This leads me to a related question about the categories that we use to make distinctions between the different groups and trends that are analyzed here. By and large, the actors described in this work fall into conventional and perhaps inescapable categories. There are the social and religious reformers on the one hand, and their conservative and traditional critics on the other. Even if occasionally one person can be simultaneously invested in the promotion of reformist ideas and in their critique, as is documented in chapter 7, if I'm not mistaken. And part of the story of this contrast between reformists and traditionalists rests, I think, on the opposition between the scholastic culture and esoteric epistemology that is preached by Sufis, such as Abdul Wahab Sharani, and the rational argumentation and clarity favored by Salafi adopters of print technology and other reform-minded intellectuals. We know, however, that traditionalist groups also took to printing quite early. We know, for example, that several of Abdul Wahab Sharani's works were printed in Egyptian publishing houses, in the Miri Imperial Press and other private companies in the mid and late 19th century, and that they became quite popular in Egypt and beyond, right? So did the editors of these works differ in outlook from the reformers that are focused here? The book argues quite convincingly, especially in chapter 2, on how emphasis on intuition and inspiration could work to depreciate or devalorize book culture. But Sha'arani, of course, continued to write prolifically, and his work was read and used and commented upon by reformers such as Jamaluddin al-Qasimi and others, as Professor El Shamsy acknowledges. Many scholars have shown, in the wake of Professor Weissman and Hudson's work, that Sufism was also integral to the revival of Hadith scholarship, the critique of madhab-based legal reasoning, and the renewal of Islamic thought in the 18th and 19th century. So my question is the following. How does the evidence that you convincingly present here relate to these studies that show how Sufism was also central to the emergence of Islamic reform? You seem to identify primarily conceptual oppositions, right? Very persuasively, not so much historical relations. But perhaps this historical relation between Sufism and reformism might also invite us to rethink the conceptual oppositions in the first place. And I'd be very curious to know what you have to say about that. Okay, so my third question is about ecumenism. Like the books that were chosen for publication, the words of collecting, printing, and publishing in the 19th and 20th century were rather eclectic and ecumenical spaces. They embraced Sunnis and Shias and Baha'is and Christians in the Arab world and beyond, right? So there are many examples in this book on how this works. My question is whether this ecumenism was the norm or rather the exception, and to what extent was the impact of print in the Arab world and in the rediscovery of Islamic classics organized along sectarian lines? Or did the publishing alliances extend also towards political visions that transcended these divides? My final question is about Orientalism. The book invites us to rethink the relation between Muslim and Orientalist scholarship in a historical perspective. It asks the question of what is the nature of this relation, the relation between Arab editors and Orientalists, and how is that relation affected by changing political configurations? The work suggests two moments, one of cooperation, even occasionally friendship, where Orientalists and Arab editors are bound together seemingly by a shared antiquarian interest in old manuscripts, despite differences in the range of commitments that each group brings to the study of these texts, followed by a more conflictual era marked by suspicion and rivalry, as highlighted in the debate about the origins of pre-Islamic poetry. And at one point, I think Professor Shamsy makes a number of distinctions between the craft and the critical reading of Arab philologists on the one hand, versus the science, or perhaps the scientific pretensions, and the skepticism of the European Orientalists. I would love to know more about these distinctions and whether you see these distinctions as applicable to fields beyond philology, for example, Quranic studies or Hadith studies or early Islamic history more generally. All of these questions are prompted by my reading of this work and are already highlighted in one form or another in Professor Shamsy's seminal work, which will continue to shape many discussions about the modern transformations of Islamic thought for years to come. So thank you so much for this, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on brilliant work.
Thank you very much, Professor Caeiro, for your brilliant remarks. And I'm sure that certainly gives us a lot of things to contemplate over. We will now have Professor Frank Peter give his commentary as well.
Okay, I want to start with a remark about what I liked in particular about the book, and then I will raise some questions for discussion. So I think the book makes apparent a dimension of modern history which has simply been ignored in most of the scholarly literature. In this literature, the authors do refer, of course, to the publication of classics, but the assumption is clearly that the archive, in the sense of the totality of accumulated text produced by scholars in the course of history, this is how Jan Assmann defines it, is already in place. The task which needs to be performed by modern scholars is simply to select from these archives certain works and publish them. So rediscovering the Islamic classics shows that the material reconstitution of this archive is in itself a major enterprise. And we see that the publication of the classics often depends upon the commitment and strenuous efforts by some individuals whose sometimes extraordinary stories the book narrates. Rediscovering the Islamic classics also shows that this print movement or print and editing movement has an intellectual and also a political significance on its own. This movement is not performing an auxiliary function by producing the material basis or the manuscript basis for various reform movements. The history of the publishing movement is not only about decisions concerning what should be included in the canon, what kind of literature is adequate to the modern context and its challenges. And these choices, of course, are important, but this movement builds upon an evolving set of knowledges about manuscripts and texts, and it contributes to various scientific debates in which historical claims about the heritage, for example, about texts or burial sites, need to be substantiated and defended. And in this sense, so if you focus on the scientific dimension, I think in particular, the book opens up a new, distinct perspective on the history of Islam in modern contexts. So one example, the analysis of the debate about the status of Jahili poetry in the 1920s is a really striking example of what we can learn by adopting this perspective. This debate, which is usually described as the struggle of a critical modernist scholar against religious conservatism, is presented in the book as a contest between different notions and different practices of how to evaluate the authenticity of texts. Of course, the controversy is also about the status of modernist ideals and practices in Egypt, but the book shows that the controversy is not simply between opposing philosophical truth claims, rather the protagonists make concrete arguments about texts and how to critically read them. So in a sense, the success or failure of modernism in this case is partly decided on scientific grounds and not simply the result of the religious or philosophical commitments of the actors. The study of the print movement also provides a new perspective on the impact of Orientalists as collectors of manuscripts, as editors and scholars. I refer you not only to the accounts of how the print movement contributed to knowledge on the classics, contributions which sometimes are foundational, but not always noticed or acknowledged by Western scholars. More importantly, I think the book makes apparent how the print movement is also a kind of laboratory for debates, which in a sense continue today, about the gatekeeper science philology, a science which is described in the book as determining which texts are released into the world, in what form they enter it, and what degree of authenticity, historical and textual, they have granted. Here again, the publication of the classical works is studied as part of a much larger cultural movement with its own dynamics to some degree, and this movement involves a critical engagement also with Western sciences and methods. So a couple of questions. The first question is about the notion of reform. You mentioned that you use the term reform in a descriptive and not in an evaluative manner. So reform is not necessarily referring to the progressive enterprise. And you also mentioned that the individuals hold different notions of reform. Printing is used by reformers of various stripes, and certain distinctions are made between reform and social reform, religious reform and social reform, etc. So, but there are also, you highlight some features which are shared by different actors, namely the critique of post-classicism, which is defined primarily as a set of textual practices and a basically self-contained literary horizon. And secondly, the critique of esoteric Sufism, and obviously the involvement in the print movement. So in comparison to conventional understandings of reform, this study seems to broaden our perspective on reform in the sense that substantive issues, such as debates about visiting graves and the normative status of this practice, are one part of what motivates reformers, but other issues which are called methodological in the book also come into play and are very important. So reform is like analyzed on two levels, a level of methodology and substantive issues. So with regard to methodology, the fundamental aim pursued by these scholars is to expand the range of writings which are acceptable sources. And second, it is to enable a form of scholarly debate which is more detached in the sense that the identity of authors matters less, and attention is focused more on the inherent strength or weakness of arguments. At one point, it is mentioned that these scholars are convinced that it's really the force of the best argument which will prevail. And this underlies this attitude. So the question is here, would it be too correct to say that the notion of reform is being redescribed in the sense that attention is drawn to methodological issues and it is shown how reform implies basic ideas about scholarly practice, about modes of argumentation, and the boundaries of debate. So ideas about what issues are fixed authoritatively in debates and what not. So the book mentions at one point that the aim is to limit the use of labels in general. So I don't know how important we should give to the term reform, but so that's like one question. Second question is about how the increasing circulation of books and printed matter contributes to change forms of sociability, and how the protagonists of the printing movement think about this issue, about the social effects of circulating printed matter. So the print movement is situated in a context which is rapidly changing, and the protagonists are to different degrees both participants and observers of these processes, which go far beyond the realm of science and literature. The modernizing state plays a crucial role, and you refer to affinities between some scholars and editors and the modernizing state. The Tahrawi, for example, is presented as the ideal reformer. His outlook on societies is basically sociological, and he sees society as an entity which can be influenced and planned and reshaped. In a more concrete sense, one can say that the print movement, as the book shows, directly depends upon the creation of new social spaces, such as public schools. The post-classical madrasa context didn't allow for the rediscovery of classical work, as the curriculum was largely fixed, and didn't accommodate additions from outside the tradition that lacked a continuous chain of transmission back to the author. So one can say cautiously that the circulation of printed matter to some degree enables and requires new kinds of social relations. There's one striking statement by Al-Qasimi in the book where he reflects on this dimension of the printing movement. He praises books as the best way of reforming society because books allow you to reach out to people whom you disagree with and to enter into debate with your opponent. He writes, I know of many previously narrow-minded folk who have found their way by means of what we have printed and published. So this is a very interesting perspective, I think, on how media can be used to make new social relations possible and in this sense to change social space. It's a perspective where print is not simply a means to amplify a message, but using print also makes a qualitative difference, right? In the sense that you can reach out to people whom otherwise you cannot easily reach. So my question here is this dimension of the printing movement, so the social transformative effects which printed matter could have or should have, is this something which is discussed in writing by other actors apart from Al-Qasimi? And a last short question is about how the print movement affects post-classical visions of Islam. The book shows that the movement is, broadly speaking, very successful, and this success is also evidenced by the critique and resistance with which it is met, partly by individuals affiliated with the post-classical scholarly orthodoxies. What is really interesting about the cases of post-classical critics that I discussed is that the defense of these scholars or journalists partly builds upon modes of argumentations which were originally disseminated by the print movement. So is it possible to say more about how important this phenomenon is, and whether this is a broader development already in the 1920s and 1930s? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Professor Peter. And I would now like to give the floor over to Professor Shamsy to engage these comments and questions.
Thank you so much for both of your comments, Professor Caeiro and Professor Peter. I hope I've written these points down correctly. And I mean, how long do I have to answer this? Can you give me an idea?
Yeah, for 20 minutes, you're good to go for 20 minutes.
Great, thank you. So again, thank you for your description of my book. It's always one of the things that is kind of scary to put a book out and then to see how people read it, and and what they take away from it, how they see what the whole project is about. And I think both of you, the points that you make are points that were close to my heart and that I found was important, and were reasons why I wanted to write this book. One point that both of you touch upon is the problem of categories in describing the various actors that I deal with. And to be honest, as I say at the beginning of the book, I try to keep the drawers that I want to put people in to a minimum, because I feel that a lot of the study of Islam is, well, a lot of the scholarship is just basically creating very, very simplistic categories and then just put people into those categories, and that kind of counts as scholarship. With regards to questions such, for example, as traditionalism and reform, I primarily try to keep these categories here in this book in the sense of kind of identifying a kind of a textual universe within which people are moving, and the traditionalism in the kind of 19th century are people who are educated within the kind of a post-classical textual world in which they are at home. And the kind of the primary kind of discovery for me, mentally discovery for me, was that there were these different universes existing. You know, that you had scholars that were learned in this kind of post-classical textual tradition, while not being familiar with the classical tradition. The classical tradition was something that had to be rediscovered, that had to be reconstructed, and that looking at the classical tradition was a kind of a radical or a reformist move. I mean, it's kind of this mental step was for me the primary step that sparked my book, because if you go today into a bookshop of Islamic studies in the Arab world, you primarily see classical works. So you think that is what scholarship what a scholar means. Or if you imagine an Azhari scholar in 1800 or something, you'd imagine that these people were familiar with these works. But the point that they weren't, and the question why that was, that kind of sparked my interest in this. I absolutely agree that a lot of these post-classical works, like Sha'rani, for example, Abdul Wahhab Sha'rani's works, were printed very early on in the 19th century. But they were simply continuing a manuscript tradition. So the studies have been done about Sha'rani's works and manuscripts, that they were probably the most copied books in the Arab world in the 18th and early 19th century as manuscripts, and then they were printed as well. So the reason why I did not focus on the printing of these works is that it's a different crowd of people who are interested in these works, and the people who are happy with printing a Sha'rani's work would not be we're a different crowd of people than the people who are interested in finding and printing classical works. I've just finished an article where I look at exactly the kind of question, again coming back to the question of categorization of what does Sufism mean for these reformers like Muhammad Abduh, like Rashid Rida, and partly I want to contribute to the kind of making this whole question a little bit more problematizing this question, because on the one hand, people like Abduh and Rida were kind of very much attached to early Sufism and early Sufi writings, and who believed that Sufi ethical writings were extremely important for reform, while they were at the same time very critical of later Sufism, like people like Abdul Wahhab Sha'rani and the kind of things that he wrote. So again, the whole thing of, are these people for Sufism or are they against Sufism is just a very it's oversimplifying the question to the extent that it actually is taking away our ability to actually see what is happening, and that there is the reform movement is also a movement of finding and selecting what is good and what is not good. They weren't just pro this or I mean, in a simple way, in terms of labels, or we're for Sufism or we're against Sufism or something like this. But they were very much engaged in sifting anew what of the tradition is helpful at this specific point and what is not helpful at this specific point, right? Which also kind of affects our view of what the classical tradition is. And part of the problem is, and the same question here also touches upon the question by Professor Caeiro on the ecumenical or sectarian dimensions of these reforms. Of course, what surprised me and what I write about quite a bit in this book is how ecumenical this is, right? So you have the Matba'at Kurdistan in Cairo, which is run by two Baha'is, or there's the Castelli Press in Cairo, which is run by Italian Jews. But they publish a lot of Islamic texts. Jews of Italian origin, but they are Arabs. They're Arab speaking, whatever. They're living in Egypt. They're Egyptians. So that there's this ecumenical dimension, and the reason why I emphasize this is that I started writing this book in 2014. This is kind of the end of the Arab Spring, and there is a lot of the scholarship, or a lot of the discussions is kind of reading back from the current perspective, right? Reading like, okay, I remember I gave a talk about Jamaluddin al-Qasimi, this Syrian scholar who died, I think, 1914, and somebody said, oh yeah, he's the father of Wahhabism, or father of Salafism, or whatever in the Arab world. And it's like, well, this is, you're telling the story from today's perspective, looking back, but actually take these people, in their context and actually see what they are doing, and that is very different. These are very different people, right? To say, okay, well, whatever, today's Daesh people kind of look back at these people. That's not, you have to, you can't just reduce people 100 years ago to who reads them today or something like this. But and that's also very simplistic. It's a very simplistic way of abusing these figures and say, oh yes, how do they relate to us today? What does reformism mean really? So I think there is a lot of, for me, there's also a lot to do about kind of figuring out my own relationship to these people. Because on the one hand, I mean, all our work kind of depends on these people, the kind of service that they provide to us, that we are looking at the classical tradition through their eyes, right, through their published works. I mean, it's not that we go for every classical work we read, we go to the manuscript libraries and look at their manuscripts. No, we're relying on their work, but then very often we're not acknowledging that it is that we owe them this debt. And if you look at the at the European tradition, all these editors, I mean, Erasmus of Rotterdam, for example, a great Renaissance scholar, Dutch Renaissance scholar, like, oh, he's a great hero of European intellectual history. What did he do? Well, he edited the New Testament in Greek and these kind of things, and he's celebrated for being this person who enables us to see something in a critical way. While these Arab editors, they're like, oh, they're these annoying people we have to put in our footnotes, after editors. Like we don't really care who they are. They're just service providers. They're like the people who bring the tea or something like this. Like, no, I mean, it's like these are central characters which we kind of try to write out of history. We pretend we look all the way back into the classical period, but we're not really doing this. And there's this period in the middle that kind of is the gateway of our vision of this time period. And so that's why I thought it was necessary to, exactly as you say, kind of an actor-centered history that that allows us from, of course there are institutional changes taking place that are dramatic, etc. But nevertheless, there are individual decisions that affect us in our perception. I mean, me as a classicist, that interests me also as a classicist, right? And that there's this large body of texts that could have been edited, and some of them have, and some of them haven't. And these are really individual decisions that were made and that affect our later perceptions. On the question of Orientalism, for example, I mean, there are so many fascinating examples that I did not put in my book. So I give you an example. Mahmoud Shakir, who I talk about quite a bit, he edited a work on early Islamic poets and pre-Islamic poets. And after the first edition came out, M.J. Kister, who was a professor at the Hebrew University in Israel, sent him a letter and said, yeah, there's this one line of poetry that is that you got wrong, and here, this is the correct reading. And in the second edition, Mahmoud Shakir writes a footnote, and he says, he writes that in the late 50s or something like this. He says, a gentle letter has reached me from the Holy Land by Professor Kister, who corrected my reading, and I'm grateful to him for this correction. While I am saddened by the fact that the Holy Land has been polluted by the establishment of Israel. Right? So it's an interesting kind of. I mean, I think that brings it down very nicely up to the one what Professor Caeiro mentioned here, that there is a great potential for textual study to be a bridge between people. Okay? So if I have a problem to get hold of a text and Ignaz Goldziher helps me, or Helmut Ritter, who lives in Istanbul in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, gets me the copy. And we talk about the correct reading. That is a basis of we're just colleagues, right? We're just people who are interested in the same thing. If we start talking about whatever the history of the Quran or the meaning of this or that or the other, it becomes, different people have it means very different things for Muslim scholars and Orientalist scholars, right? And what they use it for. But on the textual level, there's much more of a level playing field, and people are kind of common. They make common cause in their dealing with these texts. So I think it's the textual and the philological that establishes the most basic and kind of most ecumenical space. Right? If you want the best copy of this, it doesn't really matter if the person who has it is an Ismaili who lives in India, or who's a whatever, who's a Hungarian Jewish Orientalist, or whatever. So I think that is an interesting. There's an interesting dimension of these exchanges, and I think there's a lot still to be done. There's a lot of letter exchanges that I haven't considered, or that haven't been published, and that live in archives that could be used for this. Professor Peter makes a point about the kind of social relation, the new social relations that are established through classical texts, and there is a lot of possible inquiry that could be done, particularly with regards to newspapers and journals. I think there's still a lot of work that has to be done in looking at how journals contributed to the spread of classical texts. So journals as kind of a secondary or intermediary places where you have book reviews, where people write articles based on classical texts that have been published, and that kind of point out relevance for specific things. So there are some issues. For example, you have this emerging women's literature, women's journals in Egypt in the late 19th, early 20th century, and there are actually instances in which these writers, most of the time, they write things that have nothing to do with classical works, but there are some instances where these writers, they're either women themselves, or they're writing for women or about women's issues. They look at classical texts and they use ideas from that. And again, there is ways in which, just the exchange of ideas on the level of the written word, which changes. First of all, which enables something like a national dialogue, right? National dialogue on issues, and of course, print culture is much larger than just the printing of classical works. It is, there's all this stuff coming in, translations and daily journals, literatures, modern literature written in Arabic, etc. So there is this hunger for the written word that the people who edit classical works are also feeding, and they're aware of this, and they're saying that, well, there is this demand for, people want to read stuff, and you can't read a hashia, a post-classical hashia for fun, like when you go to bed in the evening, you can't read a hashia if you're not trained in reading this stuff. So, what are you going to read? Are they going to read the translation of whatever, Alexandre Dumas, or are they going to read, whatever, Al-Jahiz or Khalila wa Dimna or whatever? And so there is, it's also a kind of a competition for the attention of the emerging reading public that happens. Just as a last point before I stop, Professor Caeiro made this point that when in the kind of binary between reformers and conservatives, that there were also conservative editors, and that I don't pay particularly much attention to them in my book. And it is true, although I have to say it's first of all, it's difficult to find information about people who edited works that were available, or that were written in the post-classical period, because very often you have a book that has, these post-classical texts are very numerous in existence. So you have a work that has 300 copies, for example, in existence. There is no there's no proper, there's no critical edition done of this. They have very good copies, and they're just edited. There's not the philological problems in the way of producing this work. And there isn't much change done by publishing these books, because they had been so much in circulation before they were published. And so it's the kind of the relationship between the editor and the text is much less clear. There's much less of engagement with the text, that you can see what the editor is doing there. It's just like he brings out a tradition that is already very widespread. So my interest was in looking at people who are discovering things that were unknown in the previous era. So these are my answers to the questions that you've given me so far. I hope I was clear. Maybe I wasn't, but thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor El Shamsy, for tackling many of those very thought-provoking and insightful questions. And I think your remarks were just as insightful and contemplative. It would be a good idea now to turn to the audience for Q&A. We do have a couple of questions. I first want to start with a very early question that was thrown in the chat by Atar. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask if you have any thoughts on the evolution of the print revolution post-World War II. I would be especially interested to hear your thoughts on the emergence of Islamic book markets in Western languages.
Yeah. Okay. So my book ends basically with World War II because it has to end somewhere, but also that there is a different logic of this process with World War II, with the age of decolonization and post-colonialization, the post-colonial era. There is new centers of where this publication takes place. So post World War II, the university in the Arab world becomes much more important about editing texts. So very often texts are edited as MA theses or PhD theses. Now you actually have women editors emerging also. Aisha Abdurrahman bint Shati, she edits Abu Ala al-Ma'arri's work in 1950. That kind of seems to me the first proper female editor, and then of course afterwards you have famous female editors in different Arab countries. And you have the state institutions. The Arab League has the Ma'had al-Makhtutat. So there are many more institutions, and the center of where things are edited, also the center of where things are published. It goes from Cairo more to Lebanon, etc. So it's much more. I mean, the story kind of changes quite dramatically, and so I finished with 1940. So we have the question asks particularly about the book markets in Western languages. So the translations, but I think that is a very recent. That's an even more recent phenomenon. I.e., if I understand correctly, you're not asking about let's say Orientalist translations of Islamic texts into Western languages, but you're asking about kind of translations by Muslims for Muslims, kind of into Western languages. That would what I would assume, and that is a kind of a phenomenon of the kind of movement of Muslim peoples into the Western world, right? People from the subcontinent to Great Britain, primarily Turks to Germany, North Africans to France, etc., and then kind of the translations of Islamic texts, I mean, for their descendants primarily, for religious purposes. That is a very different kind of question, because it's secondary in the sense that they are looking at books that have been published in the Arab world, so that they are relying on the rediscovered texts and that body. I haven't come across a single book, to my knowledge, where somehow somebody went out and found a text that hadn't been edited in Arabic, but then translated into English or German or French anyway. So that it always relies on pre-translated texts, and very often these translated texts for religious purposes are not that concerned with philology. Sometimes they use bad editions, which kind of might create problems for the for the translation. I don't know. Do you think that was an answer, Ameen?
Yeah, I think that does it, and perhaps if Ashar wants, he could even ask for some clarification, or he can include some remarks for clarification. There's another question here, which concerns the influence of printed works on Islamic pedagogy. It's from Nahla Fahmy, who asks, with regard to the rise of state schools during the print movement outlined in the book and the avenue of learning it created alternatives to seminary. The book mentions how these schools were advantageous in teaching the rediscovered classical texts in the face of unwilling seminary. I wonder if seminaries intervened in the Islamic curriculum in state schools. Did they do so, or why not?
Okay, so my answer is a kind of interpretation of the questions, and correct me if I'm answering the wrong question. So as I say, the kind of seminaries are much more conservative with regards to the text that they're teaching. A very good example is when Muhammad Abdu tries to teach Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah at Al-Azhar, and the Sheikh Al-Azhar Al-Ambabi says, no, this is not a tradition. We're not teaching this text here. Even though Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, 14th century text, he said, no, we don't have a tradition for these kind of texts here. And then, of course, but in the state schools, they do get taught. I mean, I'm generalizing here, but state schools were much more open to teaching classical texts than these seminaries. And one of the reasons is that, first of all, I mean, you need a very, very specific reading skill to even read these post-classical texts, these commentary traditions. There are texts that we have, classical commentary or post-classical commentary texts that maybe nobody can really understand anymore these days. There are a couple of texts that I tried to read, and I tried to find people who could read them with me, and even traditional scholars today had problems understanding what this text was about. So it's a tradition of how to understand texts that is very specific. It's like a and in state schools, the kind of reading that you read, the kind of Arabic that you study, is also very different. And I think therefore it's much more open, or it's much more relying on classical texts rather than post-classical texts. In the sense of seminaries intervening, there is the idea of seminaries intervening in outlawing books. So there are examples. I mentioned some in my books as well of people trying to lobby Al-Azhar to declare certain texts to be unacceptable or un-Islamic. I mean, from the classical texts. So that they couldn't be taught or even sold anymore in Egypt, and that happens quite a bit. There are fights over which authors can or cannot, censorship fights, right? So there is times and places where books of Ibn Arabi couldn't be sold anymore, and then there were other times and places where books of Ibn Taymiyyah couldn't be sold anymore. I mean, this is the case for Egypt or Syria or whatever. So that this is there is a politics of censorship also going on at which people try to control what is orthodox by controlling what can be sold, even from classical from the classical book culture.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Shamsi. I just went ahead and sent you one of the other questions dealing with print production and its influence on religious authority and similarities to digitization. I hope you can see it.
So Wait, where is that?
Okay, I privately sent it to you, but
Okay.
without. Okay.
Yeah. I'm kind of looking here. Yeah. Now I see it. Yeah, I think that's a profound question. I think there is a very clear connection here in the sense that um, that a world in which everybody can read, or most people can read, is a world in which authority is more dispersed by its nature. If for your knowledge of religion, you are in need to go to a person to tell you things because you can't read yourself, for example. That's a different world from a world where you can just read stuff and I mean, let's be honest, I mean, with the internet, it's even more dramatic, right? Where there's basically you can download almost any book. You can find any book, within matters of seconds. That's a kind of, the print revolution on speed where, even if I have sometimes it happens to me that I sit here in my office at the university, I sit in my office. I know we have the book in the library, but I'm not going to get up and, waste 10 minutes going to the library. I'm just going to download it, because you can just download it like this. And you can download it anywhere you want to be. The authority of individuals is diminished, and of course that has all kind of strange effects, right? People might sit in their room and say, okay, today I've read Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, now I'm a Mu'tazili, for example, where you think, well, I'tizal kind of died out, whatever, how many centuries ago, but now you have the book, you can download it, in an afternoon, maybe you're convinced, and then you become a Mu'tazili or something like this. So there is this explosion of texts also means a diffusion of statements that people can accept or not accept, and when you look at the one of the defining features of contemporary Islamic thought is the question of authority, and does anybody have authority or not, over religious thought. I mean, this is of course a big question in Islamic thought in general, given that there is no church to fall back to, that at different times and ages, the question of who has authority, what is correct belief, is disputed, and it's never that clear anyway. It never has been that clear. But with regards to the kind of the print revolution, the effect that print revolution had, in my opinion, is that it did. One of the things that I think we really need to talk about is, for example, the extraordinary amount of authority that Sufi brotherhoods had. At least had still in the 19th century, and that was kind of, as my book shows, strongly challenged by newly printed books. So the idea that we're dealing with an institution that had so much religious authority in Muslim societies, and that this declined, and you can't just put it down to the influence of print, but it's the influence of all kind of things, kind of epistemologies, etc. I mean, the kind of inspired saint whose authoritative is of course much less present today than it was 100 years ago or 150 years ago. But print is definitely part of this, I want to say, democratization of knowledge, right? Which leads, if you are if you now can take responsibility for your political views, for your views of the world, whatever, then your relationship to religious authority is also going to change. Right? So definitely, I mean, I obviously I can't give an authoritative answer to it, but this has clearly made this is part of a story of the diffusion of religious authority in the sense of these books. Yeah. There was a question here. There was another question here in the Q&A. Muhammad, don't you think that just like the influence of scholasticism was at points diminished or undermined by esotericism, that esoteric transmission of knowledge was caused harm by print too? Yeah, I mean, what I tried to show in my book is that there was the kind of the post-classical intellectual world. You have kind of two poles of what it means to be educated. On the one hand, you are very well trained within a relatively limited kind of world of teaching texts. That's what scholasticism means, right? Teaching texts, people are like excellent in reading these texts, interpreting them, etc. And then on the other hand, you have this view of this inspired saint who doesn't actually need to engage in these scholastic hair splittings, and that these two things hold up each other. Right? This idea of that they support each other, and that with the coming of print and the kind of reintroduction, I mean, that if I understand your question correctly, that this esotericism is not anymore an answer to questions, and so if you look, Amir Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi, the kind of great Algerian hero of anti-French resistance, the books that he writes, like he writes this Kitab al-Mawaqif, so he's very much in this Sufi esoteric mode. You know, he lives in the mid to late 19th century. When he talks about a book by Ibn Arabi that's attributed to Ibn Arabi, he says, yeah, this wasn't, I don't think it's correctly attributed to Ibn Arabi because I had a dream, and in it Ibn Arabi appeared to me and he held a lion by a chain and he told me these books are not, they're not mine, right? That's his kind of, that's how he rejects this text. Now, you could reject this text because it really doesn't look like Ibn Arabi's works. You could actually do a philological reading, and that's not a, you know, you could also do this within the classical tradition, an analysis. But this kind of esoteric way of looking at it is also a way of dealing with texts. But today, that nobody kind of would find that to be in any way convincing, right? Like, okay, so I had a dream about it. That's not really an argument that affects, you know, if I had a dream about it, it's not an argument that affects you, right? But if I can give you reasons and say, look, we have Ibn Arabi's other writings that just doesn't look like Ibn Arabi's writings. There are all these vocabulary used that, and all these, you know, the oldest manuscript that we have is only from the 16th or 17th century, etc. So there's all kind of arguments I can give you where you say, yeah, that really doesn't look authentic. While you know, even 100, 120 years ago, like an esoteric thing, like a dream somebody had, would still count as an argument, as an actual argument about text. So I think in that sense, esotericism really has suffered dramatically, even though it's not disappeared, right? You can still find arguments in which scholars do this, and you know, you could write. I mean, of course, there are anthropological studies about people having dreams, etc. But I think in properly scholarly interactions, you would not find this anymore as an argument. Are there any other questions that I have overlooked, or?
Yes, and I think we should actually make this the last question for this evening. And you know, I wanted to put forward to Professor Shamsy, you know, in the process of this rediscovery and promulgation of printed Arable Islamic works, did other texts in your research considered to be canonical or indispensable sort of get sidelined? And based on what you observed, are there other indispensable works that sort of wait to be printed or rediscovered? You mentioned how Maturidi only recently began to find a readership due to its late entry into print. Among how many more scholarly works that in one juncture were considered canonical has yet to receive traction due to similar absences from print?
I think that's a very good question, but so the idea of classics, I mean, it can mean both things, right? It can mean something is a classic. If you say something is a classic, a book is a classic, or a movie is a classic, it's a specific. It's not. It doesn't just mean it's a good book, or it doesn't actually necessarily mean at all. It doesn't actually necessarily mean that it's a good book. It can. It's a station that society confers on this book or on this work, right? Saying it has a special importance for our understanding ourselves or the way that it expresses certain ideas, etc. So there are still, countless books that are only in manuscript form and that you can find and publish and whatever, and maybe some of them become classics, some of them don't. The question that you're asking, I mean, in a sense, is like, is there still stuff that is really valuable that we can't access in print? And I'm sure there is. And no, I mean, I know there is, but in a sense, the purpose of my book was to say also, the things that you now see in bookshops and in libraries, the printed classics, they're a product of people 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 50 years ago, and their interest and what they thought was relevant from the tradition. And while that is definitely worth reading, it's also that this is not objectively true, right? I mean, in a sense that there might be, they had their own interests, they had their own contexts within which they looked at the tradition and said, oh, this is really important, and we really need to look at this stuff. But that was for them, for their purposes. And maybe you have other questions, and maybe for those questions there are texts that are relevant that have not been published. And so there is not this one thing, this pre-made thing called Islamic intellectual tradition, but there is this large corpus of works. Some of which exist in many copies, some of which only exists a fragment here, a fragment there, and if you can put them together, you can do this work that have not been discovered yet. And just because a Tabari's tafsir was published in 1905 and al-Maturidi's tafsir in 2011 doesn't mean that a Tabari's tafsir is like a century better or whatever. Like we know a Tabari's tafsir better because we hear about it again and again, and people have written about it. And, like when we think of tafsir, we think, oh, Tabari's tafsir. But it's just, for whatever reason, for whatever contingency reasons, al-Maturidi's tafsir is much more recently published. But that doesn't mean that it's less valuable. And so I think I hope to also kind of inspire people to say, okay, well, definitely go read printed text, but also look at manuscripts, because there might be things in there that are particularly relevant for the present time. Right? It's and this process, it's not closed. I mean, the interaction with manuscript is not a closed process. There still are countless manuscripts that have not been edited, and that demand us interacting with them and reading them and interacting with them, and that the intellectual tradition is much bigger than just what we find in terms of printed works.
I appreciate that very much, Professor. That very good in sort of I guess problematizing this notion of Islamic classics, as you had mentioned. That it's almost we're makers of our own tradition, and I think you sort of suggested that through a quotation that you make about this idea of referencing from the past for making sense of what the current circumstances seem to be. And I don't want to take any much of your time. Thank you tremendously for discussing with us and engaging us and taking all of these questions. And I'm sure there's many more that people have. In fact, I can see one more in the chat. I would just like to ask if you're fine with us sharing your university email with people in case people wanted to reach out and sort of get a better sense of some of the things that you've shared with us today. Is that fine with you?
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
Okay, perfect. So there is your email address. It's been a wonderful pleasure, having you today. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we weren't able to bring you to our campus, but hopefully sometime in the near future, we will be able to host you in person. More for participating, our discussants, Professor Alexandre Caeiro and Professor Frank, for their questions, and the college, of course, for facilitating the event. I especially want to thank the group of readers. We actually initiated this event with a book club that decided to take on your work, and many of those participants are attended the event and even put some of their questions into the chat. So I want to thank them for their involvement in making this possible. And have a wonderful evening, or have a good rest of your day, Professor. And definitely do keep in touch with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for everybody who engaged with my work. Thank you so much for everybody who came to this talk. All the best for you, and stay safe during this pandemic, and read good books. Thank you.